You're listening to the Maritime Gardening Podcast brought to you by M.Sc Seeds. And today we have Robert Pavlis here to talk about garden boxes, raised bed, building materials. So we're going to talk about the longevity, breakdown, chemical leaching, that sort of thing. A little rundown of who Robert Pavlis is. He's got 50 years of gardening experience, award-winning author of 11 gardening books. That might be 12 by now. Seems to write a book, more than one book a year somehow. He's got a Master of Science in chemistry and biochemistry, teaches numerous gardening courses, and he's written articles in many popular magazines. And he shows up on lots of different podcasts, including mine, at least once a year. We get Robert on, sometimes twice a year, because he's got some book and I can't cover it in one podcast. Robert, say hello.
Hello, nice to be here again.
Yeah, are you guys cooking? We have a heat wave today. We had heat warning today. You notice normally people that watch this have this door closed because apparently it's distracting to have it open, but it's so hot. I need it open to get the air in here. We had a heat wave today, which in Nova Scotia, a heat wave is 30 degrees Celsius. I think it was 38 with the humidex. How was it where you are in Ontario?
We actually have beautiful weather. It's been a
Yeah.
great spring. It's cool. We had like 3 days of maybe warm weather. It rains a little bit every few days, so we don't have to water anything. The plants are growing like crazy because it's moist and not too hot. And it's actually been a great summer.
I'm going to be in Ontario this weekend.
Oh yeah.
My wife's one of her best friends is getting married.
Hmm.
And because her friend's getting married, I have to spend $1,000 on a suit and $1,000 on a flight and $1,000 on car rentals and hotel rooms and give her a present, I guess. And my weekend.
And your weekend.
Yeah. At a crucial time with my garden, a lot of things need to be like trellised and it's my wife's always complaining because I never want to leave the garden. But yeah, I'm going to be out your way. I was worried about the heat because I mean we're going to be in like Toronto, Oakville, that area. So, well, no, actually, we're going to be somewhere else. We're going to start there. We're going to be moving kind of out your way, that direction. Yeah, I can't remember exactly where we're going, but it's like to the left, up and to the left, sort of thing from Toronto, right? Anyway, so that's promising. Hopefully, last time I was there, last time I was in Toronto was before COVID, and our whole family were going to Cuba. And I remember we went there, it was July 1st, and it was hotter in Toronto than it was in Cuba.
Well, the middle of July is usually quite hot here.
Yeah.
So it might be by the weekend. We'll have a present for you when you get here.
Yes, but I guess you're outside of the concrete jungle there, so it's probably not as bad, I guess. All right, so yeah, let's get going here. So I thought I'd sort of talk about just all the different building materials you would use to build, whatever it is, a raised bed or a platform bed, or however, there's many different kinds of beds, but you've got some sort of material in contact with the soil and you're growing your vegetables in that soil. And some people are concerned about, one thing is just how long it's going to last because these things cost money. But the other thing is, as it's breaking down, what's going into my soil, and should I be worried about that? And is it getting in my vegetables and that sort of thing? So let's just start talking about natural wood. I mean, there's different kinds of woods. I don't know how much detail you want to go into there, but like here in Canada, I guess the cheapest wood you can normally buy is spruce.
Spruce. Yeah,
Yeah.
spruce is common and inexpensive. We can get cedar, but I think most of that cedar comes from out west, so it's usually pretty expensive by the time it gets to the eastern side of the country.
Yeah.
So it's usually spruce that we have.
Yeah.
And it's actually probably my favorite building material for outside.
Yeah.
Because it's relatively inexpensive, hasn't been treated in any way, so you don't have to worry about any chemicals. And as long as the project's being built so that you're not expecting it to last a long time, I think cedar or spruce is great.
Yeah.
The problem is it does rot.
Yeah,
Um,
rots here. It's about 7 years.
yeah,
Here is about.
I know she had said 7 years. I don't know if I would have given it quite that many years, but
I
um,
mean, that's like doing everything you can. Like sometimes I just had one this year that it was falling apart at the corners,
mm,
and I bent tin around the corners and
I-
just to hold it together for another season. But it's barely. I mean, you're squeezing every. And I mean, my gardens are just it's one tier, so there's no height to them. It's just like
right.
it's 2 by 6. Um, so yeah, when I say 7 years, I mean there's nothing there. It's real. It's holes through it. It's done unless you get really lucky. And I'm sure it's different in different regions. Like some places things last longer than others.
Yeah. Well, areas that are dry, I think the wood will last longer.
Yeah.
As long as you have moisture there. And of course, in raised beds, you've got the moist soil against it, so you can't keep the moisture off of it.
No.
And what you find is the inside will start rotting. The outside usually looks pretty good, and you think,
Yeah.
oh, this is great. But then you touch it and you poke a hole through it because
Oh,
the
I
inside
know.
rotted away, right?
I know.
So
My
one of
kid.
the things a lot of people do is they'll line that with plastic,
Yeah.
to protect the wood. And
Yes.
years ago, I read an article that said that the plastic is actually worse than just the wood on its own, because what happens is moisture gets between the plastic and the wood, and it doesn't let it get away. It's stuck there, and
Yeah.
so the wood actually rots faster with the plastic,
Yeah.
right?
No, that makes. I've never bothered with plastic. I spent a number of my entire 20s. I was in the trades, and we do a lot of demolition. And yeah, if you've got a house where the sheathing's compromised, so you got sheathing, and behind the sheathing you've got vapor barrier, and behind that you've got the studs of the house. And if there's if it's the slightest bit compromised, all of that water just cooks in that plastic. It's
Yeah.
just like a Ziploc bag. Um, you know. So yeah, I totally agree with that. I've never even bothered trying it because I've seen so many rotten houses with
Yeah.
all this plastic everywhere. I didn't do anything. If there's water there, where's it going to go?
Yeah.
And even if you had the moisture levels drop in the soil and the soil dried out, wood would actually dry out, but not if there's plastic there. It's going to keep it's going to cook. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, it holds it right again.
Yeah, yeah,
The other thing people try to do is then paint them or stain them or do some sort of coating, and I don't think that's worth it either. Some of those products you probably don't want near your vegetable garden anyways,
yeah, yeah.
and it's just more work, and I don't think it's going to make it last a whole lot longer. So,
No, I agree because it's just superficial. I mean, it's not like you're changing like you're putting something on the outside. It works on your deck because your deck can dry out every time that sort of thing. It's not in contact with the soil.
that's right. Yeah,
But if it's buried in the ground, that the center of your wood is just wood.
yeah,
There's no, no, it's not, the whole thing hasn't been dipped and permeated and that sort of thing. So yeah, totally with you there. Makes sense.
yeah.
And what about like, so someone that gets really clever in this, so um, I'm going to use cedar, or I'm going to use, a lot of people out here believe in hemlock and tamarack,
Mm.
or I think people in the South, what's that? It's called locust. There's this,
Locust is good. Yeah.
yeah, supposed to be. I mean, we can't, all these things cost more money. Um, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the problem with more expensive wood is that it lasts longer, but if you pay 2 to 3 times as much up front, you're probably better off just using the cheap wood and replacing it every 7 years.
Yeah, is it going to
Right?
last 2 to 3 times longer? Like,
Is it
is
going
the
to last
longevity?
20 years, right? And it costs 3 times as much? I'm not sure that's worth it.
Yeah,
The other thing I caution people is that you don't know how long you want to do gardening, particularly for new gardeners, right?
yeah,
I mean, once you've been gardening for 10, 15 years, you're probably going to do it for life, and it's different. But if you're a new gardener, you don't know if you're going to be gardening in 7 years anyways.
yeah, yeah,
And the other thing is you probably want to move it around. Like I change my gardens, right? So if this bed's
yes,
here for 7 years and I've used it. It's probably time to change the garden up and make them better, taller, wider, put them over there instead of here, right?
Yep. Oh yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
I've done whole
it's
videos
time to
on
do
that. I'm
that.
always changing the config every. I mean, I'm gardening for years, and every year, oh, that's in the wrong place. That makes no. I'm always moving things around. Always taking on these overwhelming projects, reorganizing my garden. 'Cause I'm just still. I try to optimize it. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. So I think particularly newer gardeners should expect to do that. And
Yeah.
so you're going to want to move it before 7 years anyway. So I think 7 years is fine. So around here, I wouldn't buy cedar. It's just way too expensive. I think there are other, if I'm going to spend more money and I want something more permanent, I think there's other options I would consider rather than expensive wood.
Well,
Again, your location matters probably, right? If I'm on the West Coast and we got lots of cedar trees out there and it's a common wood, then it might be relatively inexpensive. I might use it there.
yes.
But in Ontario, I don't know if we harvest any locally, but I don't think so. I think it all comes from out west.
Yeah. No, probably. Yeah. Um. Okay. Well, speaking of more permanent things, what about brick?
So brick is a good option. I think chemically wise, there's nothing really leaching out of brick. It's pretty stable. It lasts a long time. So I think brick is a really good option. Where you have to watch the brick a little bit is that you don't want to build it up too high if you're just using layered brick,
Mm.
right? Once you get up a certain height, it becomes unstable. And
Oh,
so
if you're
you have to
just
use
stacking them like
glue.
Lego.
Yeah, you have to use glue or cement or something to start holding it together. So it's
Yeah.
it's great if you're have a lower level, then you just lay it there. You don't have to do anything. But if you want to go higher, then you really should glue it together
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
cement it. And if you do that, then it becomes a very stable bed. But again, it's really hard to move. Right, that's the
Yeah.
big downside. If you
Also, like,
decide you want to get rid of it or you want to move it, you have a big job now to get rid of it.
I'd also have to think like, I mean, these are all things I've never done brick, but it's the sort of thing I lay in bed. Whenever I'm thinking about doing something, I like it's a good way to get to sleep. You think that thing through bit by bit, right? So I think about making a 4x8 bed with brick, let's say three high, so it's about 6 inches high.
Yeah.
And I think about doing it with mortar. Okay. Um, and I think, okay, let's say somehow I get the ground perfectly level. I
Yeah.
mean, when people build a house, they build a what's it called? I mean,
Foundation.
they have concrete there, and it's
Yeah.
like there's
A
another
foot,
name for that,
a
but
footing,
anyway, yeah, footing. Yeah, that's the word I was
footing,
looking
a
for.
footing.
A footing or a foundation or something, right? They have something like that before they. So let's say I'm just putting bricks on the ground, and now I start mortaring them together,
Yeah.
and then the winter comes and everything freezes and everything thaws. What does that thing look like when everything thaws out and the ground's been heaving all winter
It's,
long?
well, then you'll start getting cracks in the mortar and it will probably still hold together, but yeah, you'll end up with some cracks here and there
Think
that you
like
can then
pieces of it
fix.
will hold together. Like, yeah, they have like chunks. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, another thing I've contemplated, and I've really thought this one through, I might even do an experiment with this year, is using concrete. Uh, you know, not pouring it all as one thing because it would twist and bend and break. But like pieces, like making, let's say, I mean, there's different ways people do concrete, of course. Um, but I've thought about making 6 inch by 6 inch, 6x6 by 4 pieces
Hmm.
where I've got like rebar and or maybe concrete wire remesh in there to hold those pieces together. And I don't know how much that would weigh, but I set these pieces in place, right,
Yeah.
around the garden. Um, and I think that would be permanent. It would last a long time. It'd be very heavy. I'd have to figure out how much that would weigh. That'd be hundreds of pounds, I'd have to think.
Oh yeah.
Um, right? But they'd have to be sizable to make it worthwhile. But that brings up the question, So you got something concrete, long lasting, inexpensive. Is if if you're mixing it with the raw materials. I mean, if you're buying those bags of Quickcrete, it's going to get expensive pretty fast. But if
Right.
you buy a couple bags of Portland cement and get a cubic yard of sand and a cubic yard of crush and run, rocks,
Yeah.
um, you can make a lot of concrete pretty cheaply. Compared to, it's cheaper than wood, I think.
Right.
But what about the interaction with the soil? Is there anything coming out of that that's bad?
Well, the problem with concrete is it leaches chemicals which aren't toxic in any way, really, but they are very alkaline.
Right.
And so we find that even around houses, right, that are made with bricks and concrete, you tend to find that the soil around the house has a higher pH than the rest of the soil.
Oh,
So if you start out with acidic soil, that's not a problem because a lot of people add lime to their soil anyways.
probably be a godsend in the Maritimes where we are. It does run acidic here.
That's right.
Not
Well,
for you.
here we're alkaline, right?
Yes.
So I'm not sure how much it's going to change the pH of the soil. Probably not very much, but that is a concern some people have. Now you can compensate for that. You can put a bit of sulfur in your soil, and that'll keep the pH a little lower. But I would think that anyone who has a soil with a pH of 7 or higher, concrete's not going to be the best choice for them because of that
Mm,
reason, right?
yeah, that makes
Um,
sense.
Now I have seen some raised beds made with patio stones. So these
Yes.
2 by 2 foot patio stones, and you can
Right.
even get them bigger. And they just set those up and then brace them with metal bars that are screwed through them and hold them up like that.
Mm,
And people have used those for particularly rock gardens for some reason. And I've seen them. And a lot of rock garden plants and alpine plants actually like the lime in there anyway. So that may be why they're using.
that
But
would last.
now you've got a fairly thin board, right? The wall is only like an inch thick, maybe an inch and a half, and you can get it to 4 feet tall very quickly, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You just need to find a way to brace them.
Right. So they put steel rods down and just, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that would work.
So
These are, I've got a video of making I've got a video in my head, but man, the work involved. And the lumber you have to buy just to make the forms, like you have to buy like 3 or 4 beds
yeah,
worth of lumber just to, because you got to form the inside and the outside.
yeah,
It would be a lot, but if it works and it's inexpensive and it lasts, that's the catch. And that's where you want the bed to be forever,
that's right.
you know.
So make your first ones out of lumber, and once you're happy with everything, then you can make some concrete ones in the future.
If you if you haven't gotten too old to work with concrete, uh,
That's right.
that's heavy. Oh boy. Okay, well, so what about, I mean, this is starting to become an option for a lot of people now because the price of wood's has increased. I mean, I think the price of spruce has it tripled or quadrupled since I bought a house, right? The
Yeah.
first house was 2024. And that's when I was buying things like that. Before that, I just had apartments and, just growing tomatoes in the back deck sort of thing. Um, so galvanized steel is becoming
Mhm.
an option. And someone I work with the other day just told me that Princess Auto has these foot high three, I think they're 3 by 12 or 4 by 12 foot high galvanized steel beds for $125 or something like that. Like not too crazy, right?
They're pretty inexpensive, and they've become really popular.
Yeah.
Some of them are kind of oval shaped.
Yeah.
Some are just have straight panels with little corner things. In fact, I have one sitting in a box that I'm supposed to be unpacking and trying out.
Oh, you
Uh,
got sent one.
I got one, somebody sent me one to try.
Oh,
Um,
let me know who they are. I'll try one too. Tell them I want one too.
from Vivor,
Vivor.
Vevor.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, they're I'm sure they'll send you one to try.
All right.
Um, so I think the advantage of these are they're very long lasting.
Yeah.
Some of them are coated on the outside, so they they have colors and they look a little nicer,
Mm,
if that's your style. Uh, Personally, I think they're kind of ugly. I think wood looks much nicer in the
I agree.
garden than
Yeah,
galvanized metal, right?
yeah.
These kits are pretty easy to put together, so some of them come as already assembled. They're just like one big piece of metal you just put in the back of a pickup truck,
Mm,
or they come as separate panels that you just screw together, making it
yeah, yeah.
stronger, and you've got your panels made, right? Gonna last forever. So the one concern with those are the fact that they're generally galvanized on the inside,
Yeah.
so they last longer. And galvanized has zinc in it,
Okay.
but that's really not an issue. So zinc is one of these. I think it's still considered a heavy metal, but it's one of the least dangerous, least toxic of the heavy metals. And we, in fact, both plants and animals need some zinc in our diet, right?
Don't you
So
take zinc lozenges when you're sick?
I don't, but zinc is
Could
usually
find.
in multivitamins,
Yeah.
right? So so it's safe from that perspective. So there's no real concern of contamination of your vegetables or anything. And they're going to last forever. So they're probably a pretty good option. The other advantage to them is you can get high with them, right? So if you want to do wood, for instance, and you want your beds 4 feet high, first of all, it's a lot of wood, right? More construction work. Whereas these metal things, you just screw the corners and you're done.
You're
So
good.
it's pretty simple, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, they're relatively easy to move around, as long as they're not full of soil. So if you do want to move, you have to empty them, but
yeah,
that's
yeah.
not a big deal.
No, they're light too. I
Uh,
guess relatively light as well. Yeah,
the, the panels themselves are quite light.
yeah.
Yeah. So those are all good reasons to use it. My only argument against them is that I don't particularly like the look of them.
Yes.
Although I think if you get them all the same and they look like a set and then you line them up properly and so on, they don't look half bad.
I think the more impractical the material is, the better it looks. I mean, when you walk into my garden, the straight line you see, the first thing you see
Mm.
is all my beds made with granite rocks. It's just from the hill next door. These are all rocks I just 10 years ago pickaxed out of the ground and just carried over like a strong man. It was like my exercise. Every morning before I went to work, I'd go and get like 6 or 7. I'd be in a complete lather because I had to, walk about 100 yards with each one of these rocks, right?
Mm.
Um, so it's pretty beautiful to look, all these granite
Yeah.
rock beds. But the weeds just love those little corners, those wet corners,
Yeah.
everything you can imagine grows out of those corners. And the weeds won't come out because they're jammed in underneath a granite rock, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, what about, okay, so that's metal. Now, I just did a review of different
Yeah.
wheelbarrow designs, and I have a metal wheelbarrow, and it's just falling apart. And I was looking at the thing saying, why wouldn't they make the frame out of galvanized, like, so the wheelbarrow itself is steel, but the
Yeah.
actual part you hang on to, whatever that's called,
Oh,
the
the
carriage or whatever,
handles.
the actual barrow itself, I guess.
Mm.
I don't know what part's the barrel, the thing you hang on, the thing carrying the bucket or the bucket, the bucket and the thing. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, the big long handle things. Why wouldn't they make those out of galvanized steel? They'd last forever. They literally, the whole thing just broke. It literally broke because
Oh.
it rusted out, and it mainly rusted out because of the bolts holding it together were different metal,
Well, that's a problem with metals, right? When you
metal
have
on metal
two
corrosion. Yeah.
two different metals, you get corrosion taking place. And depending on the elements in those two metals, one will corrode much faster than the other one, and then you have that problem.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so they should all be the same. And the problem is the screws are almost always a different metal than
Yeah, but you have to see when
anything
you open
else.
your galvanized, the one you got in the box, are the screws galvanized? Or are they made of some material that's, non-reactive?
Well, I've used lots of galvanized screws in the garden, and the galvanizing doesn't seem to last very long. Once they're a couple years old, you take them out and they're already rusting and so on. Um, that is one of the choices you do have if you're going to use a metal bed, right? You can get just steel beds, and you can get galvanized metal beds, and the steel is much cheaper. Won't last as long, but most metal lasts quite a quite a long time. But the galvanizing will extend the life of these beds quite a bit, but
Yeah,
they cost you a little more.
yeah, yeah. So what about, I mean, I've got a handful of other things left on the list here. Composite wood.
So composite wood, that's a particle board material. Um, it just doesn't last outside. So
Right.
I wouldn't use it anywhere in the garden.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, people would see that they can get in these 4x8 sheets and it looks
yeah.
inexpensive and that sort of thing, but you might get a season or two out of it and then it'll just fall apart. And it's got all this, I'm sure it's got some kind of adhesive in it, although I don't know what the adhesive is. I don't know how they keep that all together. Um,
I imagine the adhesive is not a big concern because it's going to be waterproof, the adhesive itself,
right.
because they use the same material in plywood, and the plywood will stay together.
Mm,
If you want to use sheets of wood, I would go with outdoor plywood,
right.
and that lasts a fairly long time.
You mean a treated plywood?
No, not even treated, just regular plywood. As long as it's above ground,
Right.
um, it lasts a fair length of time. The problem with plywood in making raised beds is that you usually would use it if you want fairly high beds, and then you have to keep them from bowing out. The
Yeah,
plywood's
yeah,
not thick enough, right? So now you have to put a bunch of bracings across it and then thicken it up so it doesn't bow out and bend on you.
yeah.
So plywood itself for a raised bed is not particularly a good choice.
Oh, and it's not cheap anymore either. It used to be,
Yeah.
I remember used to be all these manuals on how to build canoes using uh, quarter-inch plywood because it was economical.
Yeah.
You use some plywood and some fiberglass, and you can make a canoe. Now it's cheaper just to buy a used canoe. You
Yeah.
can get a used canoe for
Yeah.
200-300 bucks, and it's going to be, have better lines and just paddle better than any plywood canoe you could ever make.
Yeah.
And it's instantly ready. You don't have to spend a week and frigging around with fiberglass and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
Um, all right,
One
so
other one other thing that occurred to me about using lumber, I see a lot of pictures of raised beds using these 1 by something, right? 1 by 6 boards,
yes,
yeah, which they're 3/4 inch, and I would never use that wood. That's not going to last at all, right? You
no,
need to use you don't have to go to 4 inch wood, but you do have to go to 2 inch wood.
yeah,
When we said it lasts 7 years, we're talking about a 2 by 4 or 2 by 6.
yes.
These thin panels that I see don't last very long. I also see a lot of commercial raised beds, particularly ones that are a little higher up with
Oh,
legs.
they sell them in the garden center. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. They
And
just use
that
the
wood
tongue
is
and
so
groove,
thin,
Yeah.
right? That's not going to last 7 years,
No,
right?
no. Yeah.
So if you're going to use, lumber, use a good 2 inch piece of wood.
I used to live not too far from a lumber mill. I don't doubt anymore. And you could go down and get their rough cuts.
Hmm.
And they would be greater than 2 inches, right? They would be variable.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't be like you could pay extra money and they would plane them down and get them consistent. But
Yeah.
these ones, one would be 2.5, one would be 2 3/8, the other one would be 2 5/8, two
Yeah.
and three quarter, right? If you're trying to make something, it'd be very frustrating because they're all different widths.
Hmm.
But one of those would last.
Yeah.
And the weight of them, they were really heavy, right?
Yeah.
So you get more wood sort of thing. More wood lasts longer sort of thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, well, speaking of that, what about treated wood?
Well, years ago, sort of prior in Canada, it was prior to about 2004, we had wood treated with arsenic. And that worked really well, kept wood from rotting. But arsenic is one of those heavy metals that we really have to watch. It does accumulate in bodies, so we don't want to be exposed to too much of it. And so they took the wood off the market because there was just too much arsenic going everywhere. It
Hmm,
would lead out of the wood. If you had used it for raised beds, it would leach into the soil, and then plants will absorb it, and then you eat it, right? I don't think the food out of those raised beds was ever really an issue, but just from an environmental perspective, they said, look, we don't want, millions and millions of board feet of arsenic going into the world, so we're going to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And partly they found a better solution, which is a copper-based preservative.
Right.
Copper is also a heavy metal, so in theory, it's also toxic, but it's not nearly as toxic as arsenic. Copper is also one of those nutrients that both plants and animals need a little bit of, so a little bit's good for us. Um, but the main thing is it doesn't really migrate very far from the wood. So
Mm.
we can get this pressure treated wood, and if you measure the soil, an inch away from the wood, you really don't find an increase in copper levels. So
Mm.
it's staying in the wood. It leaches probably a little bit right to that soil, but it's not an issue. And it's not toxic enough to be concerned about.
What about putting plastic around? Do you think, I mean, that would prevent some of that leaching, I guess, but would it accelerate the rotting process by keeping it wet all the time? Or would it
Yeah,
not rot because it's got so much antimicrobial agents in it?
no, pressure treated lumber still rots. It's just rots slower. So I
Yeah,
wouldn't put any plastic around it. I would just use it the way it is.
use it the way it is.
And I'm not concerned about pressure treated lumber being near my food. I think it's perfectly safe.
Yeah,
So I would just use the wood, keep the plastic out of there, and away you go.
right. Yeah, I have a couple beds with it. Yeah, I did a whole article a couple of years ago, or I don't know, maybe it might have been last year. And it was more of an economics thing. It's supposed to last 20 years. I mean, I'll believe it when I see it, right? I mean, I'm not going to go building everything out of it. It was more of an experiment. Like you, I was based on everything I read. I wasn't worried about poisoning my family and destroying our bodies and that sort of thing. Um, but the prospect of getting 20 years out of something that I can't remember, I did like a math, I did some math. I said, well, it costs 50% more, but it's supposed to last 3 times as long or something like that. So that's good math. That's good economics sort of thing.
It does last a long time. And in fact, I use pressure treated wood in the rest of my garden for making things like arbors and arches and so on. And there are different ways, of course, of getting that in the soil. And you can make concrete footings and so on. And I've tried them all. And I find the best way is just dig a hole,
Stick it in.
put it in, and that's it. Don't use the concrete doesn't work. If you use concrete footings, the things tend to wiggle a little bit. They're
Oh,
not
a
as
shift. Yeah.
stable. If you use those metal brackets, they don't really hold them as well. And I came to the conclusion that the best way is you just dig a hole, put it in, and leave it. And I have
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
that's 20 years old, and I've dug down to see if it's starting to rot, and I don't notice any rot.
Wow.
Now these are bigger, these are 4x4s or 6x6, so there's
Yeah. Yeah.
more wood there, right? But I really expected to see the outer inch or two rotting away and
Softness or something.
soft
Yeah.
and so on. No, that it's lasting a long time.
That's
So
amazing.
so I think if you built these raised beds with pressure treated, yeah, you're gonna last a long time.
Hmm. I'm curious to see. Um,
Mm.
what about plastic? And I don't know if when I say plastic, I could be meaning nylon. I could be meaning whatever they make them from. They have these new kinds of boards that look like plastic. I don't know what they're actually made of,
Well, a lot of those are recycled plastic, apparently, right?
like
So
old garbage
they
bags and
take your old, yeah, they don't use soft plastic, I don't think, because that's usually not recyclable, but pop bottles,
mm,
that sort of thing. And then they chop them up into tiny, tiny little pieces and then form them into boards and so on. I've never seen anything about how long they'll last, but I'm guessing they're going to last, 100 years. Because that's the problem with plastic. It just doesn't degrade. So I would think they last a long time. But I've looked at them for a couple projects, but the stuff is really expensive.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
I mean, how can it be so expensive? It's made out of garbage. It doesn't seem fair.
It doesn't seem fair, but yeah, well, that's one of the problems with the whole recycling business, right? We have this product that nobody really wants, but it costs a lot of money to collect and put back into a new product.
Yeah,
Um, and a large part of the cost is economics, right? We don't use enough of that yet, so we can't make it in large quantities, and that's when the price comes down, right? So this is a specialty product. The one place you find it a lot is in deck chairs, right?
mm.
For the garden. And it's great there because it won't rot, it doesn't give you slivers, you don't have to paint it. It comes in 20 different colors.
Or you
Um,
get your big
it's
fancy
great.
Adirondack chair, or what do you guys call it in Ontario? You know,
I
you don't call them
I just
Adirondack chairs. You call them,
I just call them garden chairs.
those ones that the Muskoka chair. Like,
Muskoka chairs,
yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
Muskoka.
Okay, it's queuing you up. The Muskoka chair. I remember when I was in Ontario. I'd never seen one before. I lived in Ontario for 6 years in university. Met my wife, and they call these things Muskoka chairs. I'd never seen one before. And then I learned that you only call them that in Ontario.
So you have the same chair, you just call them Adirondack chairs.
Well, I think it's possible that they were kind of in the Adirondacks, like those that part of the world. Maybe that's where the design started. I don't know where they started. If they're actually if Adirondack is the first place, the Adirondacks,
Right.
or the Muskokas is where they originated. Uh, that'd be a great article to write. What's the right? What came first, the Adirondack or the Muskoka?
Mm.
Uh, well, the other thing with plastic is I'm always amazed at how a couple years ago I made a stacked composting thing just using totes, storage totes from Home Depot.
Right.
Okay. Big, heavy black plastic and a different plastic for the lid, yellow, bright yellow lid.
Mhm.
And the lid is catching all the sun. And in 1 year, the lids became brittle. Um,
Mm.
right.
Well,
Um,
that's one of the problems with plastics is that the material itself is not UV resistant, a lot of it. So when plastic is made for outdoor use, then they put UV stabilizers in there that blocks that UV light, and
right,
then it won't get so brittle.
right.
I find the same thing with pails that you buy at Home Depot and so on.
Uh,
I use them outside for a couple of years and they just fall apart. And it's the
yeah.
plastic being hit by the sunlight that weakens it and it just falls apart.
That explains, I mean, I was fishing here in Nova Scotia in July. A lot of us go fishing for these fish called mackerel that you can catch from
Mhm.
the shore. You just go along the rocks along the ocean, make a big cast, and you catch these tasty fish about this long. They're fatty, oily, delicious fish. And anyway, I was out with this buddy of mine. We were fishing for mackerel, and I noticed down along the shoreline there was these two big. Anyone from the Maritimes that grew up in a fishing village would know what I'm talking about. They're called fish bins. They're about 3 feet long by about almost 2 feet wide. That's not the exact dimensions, but they're that size. Almost like the size of a trying to think like has a similar volume to a wheelbarrow, right?
Mhm.
But not the same dimensions. And they're used for putting fish in on
Fiction.
boats.
Yeah.
And the one length is for market size. Well, they have different, like use the dimensions and make decisions about what fish to keep. Um, anyway, these things last forever. Like they're made with this heavy. I've got three of them in my backyard. They were all found just garbage, sea garbage. I mean, I remember went and grabbed them. He's like, "What are you doing?" Because we had hiked like I don't know. It's like a 20-minute hike to where we were fishing. I had to carry these things back, giant buckets, right? But I said these things are built to last. I still have them. Like I still have them in the garden. They last and last and last. And uh, if I didn't need to go to the garden center, we got a place here where instead of buying in bags, you can just shovel stuff, and they'll just sort of guesstimate how much you bought and charge you. It's way cheaper. I
Yeah.
had to get a bunch of that black mulch for our front garden to make my wife happy, and I got 6 of those. And they only charge $4 to fill one of these huge things, right? I mean, here I'm sticking them in the back of my Subaru, making a mess of everything, but so tough. And I mean, like if they could make the garden boxes out of that plastic, and it must have that stabilizer you
Well,
mentioned.
if they're designed for outdoor use, they almost always have the stabilizer in there. If it's a plastic that's being, is designed for indoor use and we're using it in the garden, then it usually doesn't last very long.
How is nylon? I don't understand the difference between nylon and plastic.
Well,
What's the difference?
nylon, there's lots of different kinds of plastics.
Is
And
nylon a plastic?
nylon is just one type of
It's
plastic.
a plastic. Oh, I see. Just has a different chemical arrangement.
There's many, many different kinds of plastic.
So often they make like things that need to be really tough. They make them out of nylon fishing line, nylon gun stock, things like that.
Yeah.
But
Now, one thing that people are starting to become aware of is that all of these plastics break down and release little microplastic particles.
yes, that's
Right?
that's where we're supposed to. That's where we were supposed to go. What does the plastic do in my soil? Is it bad? Yes.
Yeah. So um, we don't know what the dangers are, but we do know a few things. We're finding them in our bodies. We're finding them inside plants. So plant roots seem to be able to absorb these very small microplastics.
Really?
If you think of plastic breaking down, you get a big piece and that gets to be smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually they get really, really tiny and microscopic. But we've found them in plants now, and we're not sure how they get in there. It's not that they maybe aren't absorbed through the roots, but somehow the root system is absorbing these plastic particles, and then they move up the plant.
They can get up the plant.
Yeah, so we're pretty sure now that when you eat your fruits and vegetables, mostly root crops, I think, but and things like apples are probably much safer. It's not likely to get into the apple, but things that are close to the ground, you're going to find these microplastics in there. They're
Wow.
pretty much everywhere. So as much as possible, I guess we shouldn't use plastic, but it is everywhere. You're going to find it everywhere in soil. And there's not a lot you can really do about it except to use less plastic. And
Right.
that's everything in the garden. So vapor barrier, weed barriers, or plastic sheeting, or putting down a plastic mulch to keep the
Mm,
weeds down. All those things are going to break down and put microplastics in your soil, right?
right.
Um,
What do
so,
microplastics do to us
well, we don't really know yet.
other than we all have it in us?
As far as we know, so far, it's not doing any harm, but it's kind of hard to believe that it's not going to do some
How can it
harm,
not?
right?
It can't be good.
So right now, in the last few years, there's a lot of research being done with microplastics.
I should ask you, I mean, so you're saying that the plant roots seem to absorb the plastic, and if you've got other kinds of chemicals or heavy metals, plant roots, how, I'm
Yeah.
always wondering, like, how do certain plants absorb more than other plants? Do they have a way of, it's not like plants absorb everything. Uh,
No,
Plants seem to like if there's X amount of nitrogen in the soil, they don't absorb all of it.
no.
How is it that the plant's absorbing things? And how is it not absorbing some things and absorbing other things? Or is it the plant just indiscriminate? It's just kind of like you've got a soil solution,
Yeah.
stuff dissolved in water, and whatever's in the water goes in the plant through osmosis.
Well,
Is that what's going on?
it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
So, and we know some things, and we there's other things we don't know. So if we look at the basic nutrients, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and the metals that plants need, it turns out that some of those enter the plant along with the water. So it's sort of a passive system. So sodium and potassium, they just travel with the water.
Right.
And if a plant absorbs more water, it absorbs more of those nutrients.
Okay.
Okay, those ions. There are other ions that the plant absorbs through an active system. So it actually has a complicated set of enzymes and so on the outside skin of these roots.
Hmm.
And the ion that is absorbing has to come into contact with these particular enzymes. And then there's a complicated process that actually takes this molecule now and sucks it into the root.
Hmm.
Okay? But the plant controls that process. So it can keep things out and it can absorb more depending on what it needs. And that's done through an enzyme process. Now, for a long time, we thought that large molecules couldn't get into a plant because they're just physically too big. Okay.
Right.
You can think of these roots as having a skin, and the skin just doesn't let everything in. Otherwise, it would fall apart.
Right.
So we thought, well, only small things can go in. So things like proteins and so on, they're too big. The molecules are too big. They won't be absorbed. But we now know that plants actually can absorb a number of the amino acids, which are relatively big molecules too, when you compare them to our nutrients,
Hmm.
right? So the plant is able to take in larger molecules, but only some of them. And a lot of that we're not real clear about how those are absorbed. The plastics, we don't know how they come in because we call them microplastics and they're small particles, but compared to the cells and the openings in the roots, these are
They're
huge
huge. Right.
pieces, right? So it doesn't make sense that they're actually absorbed, but somehow they are.
Huh.
Another really interesting thing is that plant roots have bacteria inside of them, nitrogen fixing bacteria. And we do know that the roots are able to somehow suck those bacteria into the root. And again, these bacteria are huge, right?
Right.
They shouldn't be getting into the plant, but we know they are getting in and then they travel around inside the plant. So pretty much every part of a plant has bacteria inside of it.
Hmm.
And the last I read, we're not sure how those bacteria are getting into the roots either, right? So I'm kind of at the opinion now is that large molecules probably are not being absorbed unless there's a really special mechanism to bring them in. But they can absorb more than we think, right?
Right.
And these are important questions. For instance, people use kelp fertilizer.
Right.
And some people claim that the kelp fertilizer actually does something to plants to make them grow better that is more than just the nutrients, right?
Okay.
And there is some evidence that that actually happens with kelp. And people have pointed to these larger molecules that are beneficial to the plant. The
Hmm.
problem is they haven't actually demonstrated that the plant can actually absorb these things. And so this is one of the areas that I think there's a lot of myths about these. People think that these plants are able to absorb all these useful molecules that are in kelp or fish fertilizer or compost and so on. And the plant can only absorb certain things. It can't absorb all kinds of things. So if we
Right.
do things like large vitamin molecules,
Right.
um, even if they're useful for the plant, doesn't mean the plant can actually absorb them,
Just not eating it like
right?
us.
Yeah. So, and since we're talking about this and the soil, this is one of the other areas that people are concerned about. So, for instance, let's look at pesticides.
Right.
Organic well, I call them organic because I'm a chemist, right? They're
Organic, they have carbon.
organic, they're carbon-based
Yeah.
pesticides, man-made synthetic pesticides. So,
Right.
people are concerned about this and getting into their food. But what people have to remember is that we spray it, it has to get into the soil, it has to get to the plant root. And along the way, bacteria and so on are digesting all this stuff. But some has to get to the plant root, and then plants actually have to be able to absorb it. If
Yeah.
plant roots can't absorb this toxic pesticide, it's not going to harm us. Like it's not going to get into the food and vegetables.
Right.
And I think that's something that gardeners need to be aware of. I mean, we have to be worried about pesticides and chemicals, both organic and synthetic. but it's also important whether the plant actually absorbs these things. If the
Yes.
plant doesn't absorb it, it can't harm us,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, it's just,
Um,
or it's
Another,
even, if you spray something on the foliage, it could evaporate, like, it just breaks down from sun, like sunlight breaks a lot of
yeah,
things down.
yeah,
So within a day or two, that chemical isn't even that chemical anymore. It's something else.
yeah.
Uh,
For instance, we talked about the old pressure treated wood had arsenic in it,
yes.
and people were worried about that. Well, the news is that every soil has arsenic in it naturally.
I have a well underneath the house.
It has
And
that.
whenever I water my garden using the garden hose, which doesn't go through my treatment thing, right? I'm spraying arsenic and uranium on my garden because that's what's in my well water. Small amount, but it's in
Small
there.
amounts. Yep. It's everywhere. So
Spider-Man,
we,
radioactive.
every time you eat anything, it's going to have some arsenic in there, depending on what was in the soil. Right. So we do want to minimize those things because arsenic and chromium are two of those heavy metals that are fairly
We don't
toxic.
want to be adding it to the equation.
But if you think you're doing organic gardening and you don't have any arsenic there, you're wrong. It's in your soil. You can't prevent it from getting into your food, right? Uh, doesn't mean we have to go out of our way to put more in there, but
Well, there's another thing I often wonder about as a maritimer, like anyone with a garden that knows a friend with a truck or whatever, or has a beater car, you go down to the shore and you can grab all the seaweed. You're not allowed to kill seaweed, but there's dead
right.
seaweed up on the shore after a storm. You gather all kinds of seaweed. Depending on how energetic, I usually gather it in the fall. If
Mhm.
I'm feeling really good and I'm not having any back problems and I get an afternoon where I got nothing else to do but gather seaweed, I'll go get a whole bunch, right? And I just view it like I, I just view it like manure. I think it has
Yeah.
that effect on the soil. But you gather a bucket of seaweed. You got cigarette butts, tampon applicators. I mean, condoms, everything you can imagine. Like just all these different plastics, wrappers, grocery bags. Little pieces of stuff they use for in the fishing industry, like things, elastic bands for the ones they stick on the lobster claws. Like just
Mm,
everything you wouldn't believe. I've actually found useful things in seaweed. I was like, oh, taking that. Like I haven't found a finger or a body yet. Um,
mm, mm.
so I often wonder when you go to a garden center and you buy this seaweed goo and you're supposed to add like 1 tablespoon to a liter of water and you know just, um, how much plastic and cigarette butts and you know, how much
Well,
like is that all ground up in there or what? Like how do they keep that out? Because there's all the seaweed is just full of stuff you wouldn't believe, and weeds, a
yeah,
lot of weeds. Some of
yeah,
the worst weeds in my garden are from seaweed.
yeah. Well, it's. I mean, the larger pieces they're probably going to be able to filter out, but it's always going to have little bits of plastic in there.
Yeah.
Same with municipal compost, right? It all has a bit of plastic,
Yes. Yes.
right? It's not plastic free.
I used to have a buddy. He lived in Toronto, and he had this thing he called creative composting. I mean, we were guys in our 20s, right? And you know, there's all these things you're not allowed to throw out. Um, he'd stick them in his batteries and stuff like that. You wonder how much of that stuff you could find in compost, especially municipal compost. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, I should ask you, what do you got going on with books? What's your most recent book, and what are you working on?
Well, the last published book is Food Science for Gardeners, and that will
I've not
that
read
will
that one.
no, you don't have a copy yet. Either do I.
Oh,
It'll be out in the end of August, 1st of September. It is available for pre-order on Amazon.
hmm,
So that's going to be a very interesting book, I think, because there really is no food science book for the general public. When my publisher suggested this title and the topic, I thought, well, there's got to be all kinds of stuff on food out there. And And there really isn't. There's textbooks, but there isn't anything for the general public. So it's quite interesting. It talks all kinds of things about food and nutrition and how to grow nutritious food and how to keep it safe and toxins and how to preserve it. And anyways, the whole thing. It's not a gardening book as per se. So there's one chapter on growing food. The
Huh.
rest of it is how do you get good nutritious food, on your plate.
That
And
would be, well, I want to read that and I want to have you on to talk about it. One of my big pet peeves about, gardening gurus, um, is all of the claims about health. Oh, I'm having oregano tea because it gets all the toxins out of my body, or whatever the thing is, right?
uh,
And it's like, you're not a doctor. What are you talking about, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, how much protein is in kale, and you go to the USDA thing, and like that's different than passing yourself off as some sort of homeopathy expert on
yeah.
on some cure for diabetes or whatever. I mean, it's just unbelievable the claims some people make, um, and I'm sure there's so many people out there suffering. They'll want to hear it.
I want to
Um,
hear it. Yeah.
but yeah, a
Yeah.
food science for gardener book would be great because we grow our vegetables to eat them,
Yeah.
you know.
Probably the most interesting thing I learned in that process was that we don't actually know very much about the nutrition of food, and we cannot say that A is more nutritious than B.
What do you mean, like a pear's more nutritious than an apple, that sort of thing?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we can't say that. We don't know the answer to that question.
makes sense.
So everything you've ever read, all the headlines you've ever read in your life that says, eat
Oh, acai
because
berries.
it's
Yeah,
whatever it is, we don't actually know that. We
there was
don't.
a what was it? I was watching. And yeah, for those that aren't in Canada, there's a show we have in Canada called Marketplace. I'm sure you've seen Marketplace on
Oh yeah,
CBC. So
love it.
it's a show where they take a thing people say and see if it actually is what people say it is.
Yeah,
Sometimes, or it could be, um, you know, wait times for service, or you take your car to the mechanic and you're always worried if the mechanic's lying. There was a great episode they did once with that where they have their own mechanic look at the car and diagnose what's wrong with it, and they take it to like 10 different mechanics in Toronto and just see how many things they say is wrong with it so they can
yeah,
make money, right? So all that sort of stuff. So anyway, they did one once about superfoods,
yeah.
and they had their own nutrition scientist there. And I think this was like the nutritionist for the Canadian Olympic team. And they were asking about all these superfoods, and he's like, I think if you have some potatoes and an apple and a little bit of chicken, you'll be fine. These are,
Yeah.
these all have the same things in them. Like it's yeah. So that I had a guest on the podcast once. Her name was this is a great guest. Her name was Martha Zepp. I can't remember what American college she was associated with, but she taught home economics. And she'd written something in one of these an article on preserving food, freezing versus canning versus this versus that. Um, so I had her on the podcast to talk about that sort of thing, frozen vegetables versus fresh, and a big issue with a lot of my viewers, blanching, right? So you're gonna freeze your peas, you blanch them, and then you freeze them. And so many people they think, oh my God, you're dropping in that boiling water and you're washing away all the nutrients, and now those peas are just devoid of anything good. And she was talking about, and I think I wrote an article once on just using USDA numbers, comparing, boiled versus fresh. And for some things, there's less in the boiled than in the fresh. This is what Martha was talking about as well.
Mhm.
For some things, there's no difference at all, like protein or whatever, right? For certain things like vitamin C, but it's not like it's all gone. There's still vitamin
Oh,
C. So like we cook most of this is an argument I get into people at work all the time. We cook most of our greens. I even cook lettuce sometimes. And so, like, we just had a salad with our supper, and we had 5 people. My son's girlfriend was here, and so we had an amount of lettuce in the salad, and people didn't even finish that amount of lettuce.
hmm.
Okay, I think about 2/3 of the salad got eaten. The rest I'm going to have for lunch tomorrow because Dad is the ultimate compost bin. Now, there's a way I cook lettuce. I've done videos on it. If I'd cooked lettuce, I would have cooked all of it. All of it would have gotten devoured. It would have just disappeared practically. People would have eaten all of the lettuce. And even if the lettuce had half as much whatever in it, if you eat 3 times as much lettuce, you're going to get more. So that was the kind of thing we were talking about, how like it doesn't really matter if you're eating, if it's cooked or, these various forms of preserving the food. It's not like everything's gone. If it has less vitamin D or vitamin A or whatever, it still has vitamin A and vitamin D. It just has a little bit less.
Right.
So I'm really curious to read this. And I also don't think I've read, what was it called? Microbial Science for Gardeners?
Microbe science, yeah.
Microbe Science. I don't think I've read that one. I'm not sure.
I don't remember.
Yeah, I'll have to look back on our podcast. I don't think I've gotten to that one, but I'm really, really excited to read this food one.
The latest thing I've done is I've created a free ebook on growing great tomatoes.
I saw that. I was just on your website today.
Yeah. So that was I just finished that a couple of weeks ago.
What's your website called again?
Gardenmyths.com.
Garden Myths is on that one, gardenmyths.com.
Yeah,
okay,
and if you go to the books, there's a books menu and it's on there, and you can just download it for free. And it's about a 75-page ebook on growing tomatoes.
The secret is Epsom salts and antacid tablets placed underneath the roots, right?
No Tums allowed.
No Tums allowed. I think that was one of our first episodes. First time I ever had you on, we talked about like things people say you should do and that you shouldn't do. And one of them was putting Tums underneath your tomatoes to solve blossom end rot.
Yeah, do you grow a lot of peppers?
Yeah, I grow maybe a dozen a year, something like 16 to a dozen a year.
So do they ripen indoors if you harvest them green?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I wait till there's a hint of color, but the slightest hint.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always have to harvest. I mean, there's a point in September where I just put them all in a cardboard box and bring them in.
Yeah.
And all but a few will ripen, but I think there's some hump they have to get over. So some of them look completely green and then they turn red, and some of them look completely green and don't turn red.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a point. Yeah, it's actually really hard to find any scientific information about that. And a lot of pepper growers disagree. So that's what I've been doing the last couple of days is trying to figure out that. And it turns out that you if you harvest them too green, they won't turn red.
Is that what a green pepper is? Like when you get a green pepper at a grocery store, is that a pepper that was?
No, all green peppers will eventually be some color.
Right. Okay.
There's a wide range of colors, everything from black to purple to yellow and so on. But there's really no such thing as a green, certainly no such thing as a green sweet pepper.
Right. Even though they sell them. Yeah.
Well, they're just harvested early.
Harvested early.
Green.
What were you going to say? I cut you off.
Yeah. So not really sure. Now, I don't know about other types of peppers. So there are different types of peppers, but for the sweet peppers, the bell peppers, I don't think there is a green pepper. There probably is in the scientific world because there are some mutations that will never turn red that the scientists use. I don't know if those are actually in commercial use.
So in principle, I mean, is it like the tomatoes, what's it called? Ethylene gas? Is that what helps it? Like if you put it in a cardboard box and keep the gases in there, put it in a brown paper bag or whatever, will that accelerate the coloration of the pepper?
Ethylene gas only works for some fruits and vegetables. It has very little effect on peppers.
I see.
And it does have a little bit of effect, so it speeds it up slightly, but not nearly as much as other vegetables.
Right.
So the degree in which ethylene gas speeds things up varies depending on what the vegetable is.
Right.
And some, in fact, have almost no reaction whatsoever.
Man. No, I would say the majority of the peppers I eat from my garden are ripened indoors off the vine. Because they don't start to ripen until it
So,
just takes so long. And I'm trying a new variety this year. I've been growing sweet Italia or sweet Italians for the last 2 or 3 years, and they've worked. And M.Sc Seeds sells a variety called Carmen, which is supposed to be a hybrid of that.
hmm.
And I had a friend of mine that I go fishing with recommend them highly, so I decided to try them. My Carmens are still just 6 inches high right now, right? So, I mean, a lot can happen in September, in January, in November, August, and September. A lot can happen. A lot of things can happen in those 2 months.
Hmm.
So I'm not, but yeah, I don't. I'm not looking, uh, not looking too big yet. So they have
Hmm.
not. They've really just barely grown since I stuck them in the ground.
Hmm.
So I don't know what's going on. Whereas the tomatoes I put in the ground and tomatoes, basil, and peppers. The basil almost died when I put it out. So much that I pulled a lot of it because I just gave up on it. But the ones I didn't pull actually came around, and
Hmm.
they look really healthy now. And the peppers didn't seem to suffer when I stuck them in the ground, but they just haven't seemed to have grown much.
Hmm.
Maybe I'm just being impatient. But the peppers or the tomatoes are like, 4 or 5 times. They're almost 2 feet high now.
Hmm.
So it's hard to understand sometimes. Anyway, so you're going to be writing a
Great.
blog post on peppers,
Probably
right? How
another week.
often do you write your blog posts?
I would like to do it once a week, post something. This summer it hasn't really happened.
I feel you there, man.
If I like, I took a couple of weeks off to write this tomato book, so then I don't publish anything for 2 months.
Yeah.
And of course, publishing the blog and trying to make YouTube videos, and
Yeah.
and I'm getting older, so I'm slowing down.
Yeah. So for those that, just wrap it up here, but for those that, Robert has a number of books. Just go on gardenfundamentals.com, or does that even exist anymore? Is it just you have two
Uh,
websites?
if you
We talked about this at the
doesn't
beginning
it
of the
doesn't
show.
exist, but if you type it in, it will just take you to the other one. So my
Garden
main
Myths.
is gardenmyths.com.
Garden Myths. Okay. So you got all these books you've written, and we've had, if you look back over the history of this podcast, we've had Robert on to talk about maybe not all the books, but most of them.
Most of them.
And also great YouTube channel, very good videos. And that's called
Garden Fundamentals.
Garden Fundamentals. That's right. And on the Garden Myths website, there's a thing you can click to get his blog, and he writes something almost every week, barring unforeseen circumstances. And they're always very thorough and well written articles. I enjoy reading them, and highly
Thank you.
recommend the contact. Okay, Robert. Well,
All right.
great. Once again, great having you on the podcast. Can't wait to have you on again, and I can't wait to read that book.
Well, I'll get you a copy, and
Oh, absolutely.
then we'll discuss it all
Uh,
about food.
yeah, no, that'd be great. One of my favorite things. I'm gonna
I
go have
know.
some food right now.
Me, me too. All
Okay,
right. Thanks
maybe.
for having me on.
Yeah, great. All right, everybody. Hope you found this interesting. If you did, please like, share, subscribe, and until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.